The message arrives while you are finally sitting down. Not during a work hour, not during a moment you had marked as available, but during the 20 minutes you had protected for yourself. A meal, a conversation with someone you love, the early edge of sleep. The message does not ask whether you are free. It contains a task, a deadline, and an assumption. It was sent because the sender already knows you will respond. Introduction. What just arrived is not simply a request. It is the visible surface of something that has been accumulating for months or years. A set of terms that governs when you may rest, who may interrupt you, and what your silence implies. Nobody handed you a document. Nobody asked you to sign. But the contract exists all the same, built clause by clause from every time you answered quickly, solved the problem, and stayed reachable when others assumed you would be. The peculiar feature of this kind of agreement is that it requires no formal negotiation to become binding. Repeated behavior, sustained over enough time, communicates its own terms. When you have been consistently available across mornings, evenings, weekends, and emergencies, the people around you have not simply noticed your generosity, they have restructured their days around it. Your access became part of their planning. And because planning depends on what it can count on, your availability stopped being a gift and became an infrastructure. What this book intends to do is recover that infrastructure for examination. Together, you will identify the specific clauses embedded in the contract you never signed. The expectations about speed, priority, emotional presence, and permanent access that now govern how others approach you. You will audit which of those clauses reflect genuine duty, which reflect legitimate shared history, and which reflect assumptions that were never actually yours to fulfill. And you will learn how to renegotiate access without disappearing from the people who genuinely need you, and without dismantling the generosity that made you trustworthy in the first place. The central question runs through everything. How did occasional availability become a permanent obligation? And what would it take to put your name on the contract only where you actually agreed? Chapter 1. How access becomes a contract. It began with something real. A genuine emergency. A moment when someone needed you and you were able to help. And stepping forward was not only the right thing, it was the obvious thing. A colleague's presentation collapsed the night before a deadline. A family member called in a state of genuine distress. A client reached out with a problem that, left unaddressed, would have caused serious harm. You responded quickly, not because anyone had negotiated a policy, but because the situation required it and you were capable. The relief that followed your intervention was real too. You could see it, in a body that visibly relaxed, in a voice that steadied, in the gratitude offered afterward. That gratitude was not manipulation. It was an honest human response to being helped when it mattered. And because the outcome was good, and because you had been the one to produce it, a quiet association formed. When things go wrong, this person responds. A second request came, carrying similar language. Another urgent matter, another reasonable framing, another situation in which your involvement appeared to be the most direct path to a solution. You responded again because the circumstances resembled the first time, and the first time had worked out well. The speed of your second response confirmed what the first had suggested. The pattern began to settle. What happened in those early exchanges is worth preserving rather than condemning. The generosity was genuine, the care was real. The problem is not that you responded. The problem is that responding established a precedent that neither party examined before it hardened into expectation. The exception was never renegotiated once the emergency passed. It simply continued, carrying the emotional weight of the original crisis into circumstances that were less urgent, less exceptional, and increasingly ordinary. By the third or fourth request, the framing may have barely changed, but the underlying situation often had. The urgency label remained, the tone of necessity remained, but the actual emergency had given way to something more like habit, the habit of reaching for you first, because reaching for you first had consistently produced results. Your responsiveness had become, without formal announcement, a feature of the environment rather than a choice you were making in real time. This is the critical point. The transformation from exception to expectation does not require dishonesty. It does not require that anyone calculated a strategy to exploit your goodwill. It requires only repetition and the absence of renegotiation. Once a behavior has occurred reliably across enough situations, it begins to function as a norm, and norms, unlike explicit agreements, are rarely discussed. They are simply lived inside. The original generosity deserves recognition precisely because the contract that formed around it was not born from a failure of character. Something genuine was offered and something genuine was received. The difficulty is that generosity, when made reliably predictable, stops being experienced as a gift. It becomes a resource, something that can be drawn on, planned around, and eventually counted on as though it were always there regardless of your state or your own needs. What opened in that first exchange and continued through every subsequent response was the question of predictability. When people can predict your behavior accurately, they begin to organize around it. And when they have organized around it long enough, that organization starts to feel like evidence of an agreement, even if the only agreement was the one your consistent behavior implied. The workplace version takes shape quietly. A colleague learns that if they send you a draft late in the afternoon, you will return useful notes by the following morning. A manager discovers that the corner you occupy in the workflow tends to catch what falls through elsewhere. The acknowledgement arrives implicitly, in being assigned certain tasks, in being included in certain chains, in being the person whose name comes up when someone asks who can fix this quickly. Over time, colleagues stop developing their own solutions to the problems you reliably solve. Why build a redundancy when the original system never fails? Inside a family, the routing operates differently, but follows the same logic. The person who always figures out the insurance claim becomes the person who handles all insurance claims. The parent who always knows how to reach the specialist becomes the first call when any medical question arises. The sibling who remains calm in conflict becomes the one invited to mediate every disagreement, regardless of their current capacity or distance from the situation. The family has not assigned these roles through committee. It has simply observed which paths produce the fastest, most reliable results, and then deepened those paths through repeated use. Friendship presents its own version. The friend who always picks up the phone after midnight, who always has time to listen, who always finds words that help. That friend becomes the destination for distress across a widening range of people and circumstances. What began as genuine emotional intimacy expands into an informal counseling arrangement that no one named as such. The calls grow longer, the situations grow more complex. The expectation of availability becomes embedded in how the friendship is defined. When a system adapts to a reliable resource, it does not simply use that resource more efficiently. It stops developing the infrastructure that would exist if the resource were absent. The colleague who depends on your deadline rescues stops building buffer into their own schedule. The family member who routes emotional tasks toward you stops learning to tolerate certain kinds of discomfort without external help. The friend who calls at midnight stops cultivating the broader support network that would serve them if you were unavailable. Your reliability, precisely because it has been so consistent, has created a kind of institutional dependency, not through anyone's design, but through the natural logic of systems that adapt to what they can count on. It is worth pausing on this without assigning blame too quickly. The dependency that forms around your availability is not always a product of bad intent or calculated advantage. Much of it arises from the entirely human tendency to follow the path that works. When a path works reliably, people use it. When alternatives have not been tested recently, they feel uncertain. And when alternatives have never been built at all, the person using your path may genuinely not know that other paths exist. Distinguishing deliberate exploitation from passive dependence matters, not to excuse passivity, but to respond to each accurately. There is also something worth naming on your side of the equation. Reliability carries its own rewards. Being the one people depend on creates a certain form of significance, a confirmation that your presence matters, that your capacities are real, that you are irreplaceable in at least some domain. This is not vanity, it is a recognizable human need. The difficulty is that when significance becomes tied to continuous availability, unavailability starts to feel like a threat to identity rather than a reasonable limit. Your own investment in the role has become part of what enforces the contract. But investment does not remain stable indefinitely. Capacity changes. Life adds obligations. The generosity that was freely available at one season of life may be genuinely scarce at another. What the people around you have rarely been told, because the shift happened gradually, internally, without announcement, is that the conditions under which the original access was established have changed. The expectation survived the change in conditions because nobody communicated that the conditions had changed. The contract continued because both parties kept behaving as though the original terms remained in force. The expectation proves surprisingly durable, even after your circumstances shift significantly. Someone who took your availability for granted before you had children tends to keep reaching out at the same frequency after the children arrive. Someone whose professional requests you answered quickly during a calm period of your career continues to send those requests at the same pace during the most demanding stretch you have faced. The expectation was not recalibrated. It was simply maintained, because the contract contained no expiration date and no clause requiring periodic review. What grows from this durability is a particular kind of quiet pressure, the sense that the world has organized itself around your access in a way that makes changing the access feel structurally disruptive rather than personally reasonable. The system is not making an argument, it is simply continuing to operate as it was built. And built systems tend to resist modification, not because they are hostile, but because they were designed around assumptions that nobody ever formally agreed to examine. The arrangement continued, and continuation communicated something. Every week that passed without a direct conversation about the terms was another week in which the terms consolidated. This is not a moral failing. Most people do not renegotiate arrangements that appear to be working, and from the outside, the arrangement did appear to be working. Requests were being sent, responses were arriving. The surface was smooth. What was not visible from the outside was the cost accumulating internally. The discomfort with the pace of requests, the growing sense of being reached into at inconvenient moments, the private calculation of what was being given up each time an interruption arrived, all of that remained inside. It was not shared, not because the communication would have been impossible, but because the right moment never clearly presented itself, or because raising the issue felt like a larger confrontation than the specific case seemed to warrant, or because the complaint felt ungrateful, given how much the relationship had historically meant. From the perspective of the person sending requests, nothing unusual was happening. They had sent a request. You had responded. This pattern had continued without incident for long enough that it felt stable. They were not reading your silence as distress. They were reading it as agreement. In the absence of any signal that the terms were uncomfortable, the most natural interpretation of continued participation is willing participation. This is not a cynical interpretation. It is the ordinary assumption people make about arrangements that appear functional. The gap between internal experience and communicated reality is where the resentment seeds itself. You begin to feel that the arrangement is unfair, but the other party has no data to support that impression. The only information they have is that you keep responding. When the resentment eventually surfaces, in a shorter tone, an uncharacteristically late reply, an offhand comment that carries more edge than the moment seemed to require, the other person is often genuinely confused. From where they stand, nothing had indicated that anything was wrong. What looks voluntary from outside rarely feels voluntary from inside when the original terms were never established explicitly. Behavior that began as a choice calcifies over enough repetitions into a track. The track feels like a choice because you are technically capable of stepping off it. But stepping off it now would require a disruption, a conversation, an explanation, a renegotiation that the track itself never anticipated. The path of least resistance is to stay on the track. And staying on the track is what the other party observes as consent. The legal language of consent does not apply here, and the purpose is not to litigate. The purpose is to name the dynamic accurately. When a behavior is repeated without objection, observers tend to interpret the repetition as endorsement. This interpretation is understandable. It is also incomplete because it treats the absence of resistance as equivalent to genuine agreement, and those two things are not the same. Genuine agreement requires that both parties understood the terms when they accepted them. Silence under social pressure, exhaustion, or the absence of a clear renegotiation moment is not agreement. It is continuation. At some point, the resentment crossed a threshold where it became impossible to ignore. Something specific happened. A request that arrived at a particularly bad moment, a tone that carried particular entitlement, a consequence of unavailability that made the cost suddenly concrete. And the internal reckoning that had been deferred finally arrived. Before that moment, the arrangement was survivable, if uncomfortable. After it, something had to change. The question was no longer whether to renegotiate, but how to do it without erasing relationships or abandoning genuine responsibilities. That moment, wherever it sits in your personal history, is the point at which the contract became legible. Not because it was new, but because the accumulated pressure finally forced it into visibility. The clauses had been operating all along, they just had not been named. Before renegotiation is possible, the clauses need names. Before they can be named, they need to be seen in their specific identifiable forms. That is the work of the next section, not to condemn the arrangement, but to read what it actually contains. Chapter 2. The 7 Hidden Clauses. The first clause embedded in the contract could be called the speed clause. It operates as follows. When a request arrives, it expects a reply within a window determined not by your schedule, but by the sender's sense of urgency. The window is rarely announced explicitly. It is communicated through tone, through the frequency of follow-up messages, through the expression of mild surprise when your response takes longer than usual. The speed clause does not require a stated deadline. The expectation is carried in the structure of the message itself, in its assumption that you are already oriented toward the sender, already partly available, already monitoring for their arrival. Adjacent to speed is the priority clause. This one reorganizes your existing commitments around the incoming request. When the priority clause operates, the unstated expectation is not merely that you will respond quickly, but that you will move whatever you were doing aside to do so. A focused task gets interrupted. A conversation with someone in the same room gets suspended. A period of rest gets shortened. None of this is requested in language. The request simply assumes that its own urgency is self-evidently greater than whatever you were doing before it arrived. The clause functions precisely because it never states itself. If it stated itself openly, "Please stop what you are doing and address my need first," it would invite examination. Unstated, it simply operates. The third clause governs the channels through which access is permitted. Call it the access clause. Over time, the people who have your availability often acquire not just your phone number, but your secondary email address, your messaging application, perhaps the number of someone who lives with you, perhaps the knowledge that a particular platform receives faster responses from you than another. Each channel represents a different layer of access, and the accumulation of channels signals in a way that words did not, that reaching you across contexts and times is acceptable. The access clause does not usually feel like an intrusion when each channel is opened. It only becomes visible as a clause when you notice that there is no longer a context in which you are not potentially reachable. In a work environment, these 3 clauses often operate simultaneously. A message arrives on a Friday evening expecting a reply before Monday. It assumes your work schedule is available for consultation even during personal time, that whatever weekend obligation you held is lower priority than the professional matter, and that the combination of your work number, personal phone and messaging platform guarantees that you will receive and process the request regardless of when it arrives. Each individual assumption may seem minor. Together, they constitute terms that a negotiated employment arrangement would likely not contain. Inside a family, the same clauses operate with a different texture. The family member who needs an immediate response to an administrative question, who expects that question to supersede your existing task, and who has access to your presence 24 hours a day within a shared home, is using all 3 clauses simultaneously, with the additional weight that family relationships carry Obligations, work relationships may not. The clauses are harder to see when they are wrapped in genuine affection and legitimate interdependence. There are situations in which speed, priority, and access are not only reasonable but necessary. A genuine medical emergency justifies immediate response and immediate priority, regardless of what it interrupts. A dependent who cannot safely wait for a scheduled response window has a legitimate claim on access. These exceptions are real, and any renegotiation that fails to preserve them is not a limit. It is a failure of duty. The work of distinguishing the clause from the legitimate exception is one of the central tasks of the audit that comes later. What the cumulative effect of all three clauses produces is a particular quality of attention, one that is never fully present in any given moment, because part of it is always pre-assigned to incoming requests. The monitoring that keeps you accessible across channels and contexts carries a cost that is not itemized in the speed, priority, or access expectations individually. It only appears when you examine how much of your internal bandwidth has been silently committed to remaining reachable. Before examining the remaining clauses, it is worth sitting with one direct question: who established each of these terms? Not who benefits from them, not who enforces them, but who originally set the expectation that replies should arrive within this window, that your existing commitments should yield to incoming requests, and that you should remain reachable across all available channels. In most cases, the honest answer is that no one established the terms explicitly. They emerged from behavior over time. That origin matters because terms that emerged from behavior can be changed by behavior, once the behavior is deliberate rather than automatic. The fourth clause concerns emotional regulation. When someone in distress first reached out to you and found steadiness, they received something valuable. Not just information or logistical help, but a quality of presence that made the distress more manageable. That steadiness, offered once under genuine circumstances, became associated with your availability. Over time, the expectation formed that when emotional conditions became difficult, your presence would provide stabilization. The calming clause does not ask whether you are emotionally available. It assumes that you are because you have been before, and because your steadiness appeared to cost you nothing from the outside. The fifth clause extends this into active rescue. The rescue clause operates when the person in distress is not simply seeking presence but a solution. When the implicit expectation is that you will identify the problem, propose or implement the resolution, absorb the urgency, and return the situation to stability. The distinction between being a witness to someone's difficulty and becoming the designated manager of that difficulty is rarely discussed. It tends to be established gradually, through a series of moments in which you moved from the first role to the second, because the situation seemed to call for it and because you were capable. The problem with repeated rescue is not that it is unkind. In many cases, it is, in the immediate term, the most loving possible response. The problem is what it prevents. A person who is consistently rescued before they have fully confronted a difficulty does not develop the tolerance for that difficulty or the competency to navigate it. This is not an indictment of their character. It is a description of how competency develops. Skills that are never needed go unbuilt. When your availability as a rescuer has been reliable enough, the people you help may have stopped building or maintaining the skills your rescue replaced. Their dependence on you is genuine, not because they are weak, but because the circumstances never required them to develop otherwise. None of this erases real vulnerability. Some of the people who have come to rely on your emotional steadiness and problem-solving capacity have genuine needs that reflect real circumstances: illness, loss, limited resources, histories that have legitimately narrowed their options. Distinguishing between dependence that arose because your access made other development unnecessary and dependence that reflects real and lasting need is one of the most sensitive parts of the audit ahead. Legitimate care cannot be abandoned in the name of boundary maintenance. But legitimate care looks different from being the first and only call for every form of distress in every season of another person's life. There is also something worth examining on your side of the calming and rescue clauses. Many people who become the steady, solving presence in others' lives experience a specific discomfort when someone they care about remains in difficulty without their intervention. The discomfort is real. It is not simple pride. It often contains genuine compassion, a trained instinct to help, perhaps a history in which providing help was a form of safety. The fear of not helping can function as a driver of availability that is at least as powerful as any external expectation. The contract is enforced from inside as surely as from outside. One of the mechanisms through which the emotional clauses enforce themselves most durably is the way that distress increases pressure on availability. When the person reaching out is genuinely suffering, the ordinary cost-benefit calculation around response time collapses. The urgency created by distress makes hesitation feel cruel. This is a feature of genuine emotional connection, not a manipulation strategy, though the effect on your availability is the same regardless of intent. The emotional weight of distress tends to override the information that your own capacity may be limited, or that the rescue being requested may not actually be the most useful form of help. The sixth clause is built from time itself. Call it the permanence clause. Its logic runs as follows. Because access existed for long enough, it should continue to exist. The history of your availability becomes, in this reading, a kind of evidence of your ongoing agreement. Past reliability is treated as a binding commitment to future reliability, not through any formal renewal of terms, but through the assumption that what has always been true will remain true. The permanence clause is rarely stated as a principle. It surfaces when someone is surprised by your unavailability, and the surprise carries a quality of feeling wronged, as though the historical record of your access created an entitlement that your current limit has violated. The seventh clause is more specifically relational. The gratitude clause operates from a different direction than the others, not from the structure of repeated behavior, but from the accumulated weight of significant help given in the past. The reasoning goes, because you once did something genuinely important for this person, because your presence at a particular moment changed their situation in a meaningful way, that historical service creates an ongoing moral credit that makes your availability now something they are owed. Past generosity is not simply remembered warmly. It is invoked, consciously or not, as a basis for current access. When someone reminds you of how much you meant to them during a difficult period while making a request in the present, the gratitude clause is often in operation. Both clauses surface most visibly when renegotiation is attempted. The person who is told that your availability will change often responds by reaching backward, by citing the times you were present, the moments that would have been worse without you. The history that suggests your care is genuine and therefore should continue without limitation. The invocation of shared history during a renegotiation conversation is worth reading carefully because it may contain two very different things simultaneously. It may genuinely reflect how much the relationship has meant, and that meaning deserves acknowledgement. It may also be functioning as leverage, as an argument that your past investment obligates your future access in a way that forecloses the possibility of changed terms. Distinguishing gratitude from obligation is not about diminishing the significance of shared history. Relationships with deep history carry genuine weight. What they carried yesterday and what they are permitted to extract from you today are not the same question, but the permanence and gratitude clauses tend to treat them as identical. The emotional force of a meaningful shared past can make the simple statement of a changed capacity feel like a betrayal, when in fact the betrayal, if there is one, is the assumption that past generosity never had a natural boundary. Real histories contain both legitimate and expired assumptions. A promise made explicitly during a specific set of circumstances may retain moral weight even after circumstances change, or it may have been reasonable to assume that the promise was context-dependent and that changed conditions release the original parties from exact adherence to its terms. These distinctions are genuinely complex, and the complexity is worth sitting with rather than resolving through a formula. Not every historical expectation is illegitimate simply because it creates inconvenience. Not every claim to continuity is manipulation simply because it limits your freedom. What requires examination is the specific character of each historical tie. Whether a given past-based expectation reflects a legitimate commitment or an expired assumption is a question that only the specific relationship can answer. The work of the audit is not to invalidate shared history, but to examine which of its deposits are still drawing interest you actually agreed to pay. Of all 7 clauses, the one creating the sharpest resentment tends to be the one whose terms you least consciously chose, the expectation that grew most directly from behavior rather than intention, or the historical claim that was most clearly never explicitly agreed to. Before moving to the question of enforcement, it is worth letting that question settle. Which clause in the specific constellation of your relationships generates the most reliable sense of unfairness? The answer tends to point toward the renegotiation that is most necessary and also the most difficult. Chapter 3. How the contract is enforced. The first signal that you have failed to meet the contract's terms usually arrives as surprise. Not an explicit accusation, simply a visible hesitation in the other person's response, a brief pause that communicates that something unexpected has happened. You were unreachable, or your reply arrived later than the pattern predicted, or you answered a question with a question rather than a solution, and the surprise registers in their expression or their message as a small form of disorientation. The disorientation is real. From within the world they have organized around your access, your unavailability is genuinely anomalous, an interruption in a system that had been functioning reliably. The surprise, when not immediately addressed by your return to availability, often shifts into disappointment. The shift is worth paying close attention to because disappointment carries a moral implication that surprise does not. When someone is disappointed, the ordinary inference is that someone failed to do what they should have done. Disappointment positions unavailability not as a personal decision, but as a default. This framing does not usually arrive as an explicit accusation. It lives in tone, in word choice, in the particular quality of a sigh or a message that says only that they had really been counting on you. The moral weight lands without a direct argument. What follows disappointment, when your unavailability persists, is often an escalation of urgency. The request that initially carried a 2-day deadline suddenly carries a 2-hour deadline. The emotional temperature rises. The problem, which was serious before your hesitation, becomes critical after it. Some of this escalation reflects genuine time pressure that your delay has made worse. Some of it functions as a mechanism, an increase in stakes designed, consciously or not, to make continued hesitation more difficult to sustain. Distinguishing between these two situations is one of the important skills the contract audit develops. Genuine time sensitivity deserves a different response than manufactured urgency, and most situations that present themselves as the former are genuinely one or the other rather than ambiguous. A patient whose medication needs to be refilled before tomorrow is facing real urgency. A colleague who claims their deadline has moved up by 48 hours because you did not respond within 4 hours of a weekend message is presenting something else. The critical variable is whether the urgency existed before your hesitation or developed because of it, because urgency that appears only after you push back tends to reveal its purpose rather than its necessity. When urgency fails, the pressure sometimes shifts from the stakes of the situation to the quality of the relationship. The tone changes in a way that positions your hesitation as evidence of diminished care, as though the limit you are setting reveals something about whether the relationship matters to you rather than something about your current capacity. This is the moment when the enforcement mechanism is operating most directly on your identity rather than on the practical consequences of unavailability. Your reflex in that moment, the impulse to prove your care by restoring access, is exactly what the mechanism is designed to activate. It is worth pausing on a specific distinction that the pressure tends to collapse, the difference between who owns a problem and who is currently feeling the pressure of that problem. When someone else's difficulty is acute and your access is what they are reaching for, the emotional proximity of their distress can make the problem feel jointly owned in a way that reorganizes your sense of obligation. The problem is real. The urgency may be real. The question of who is responsible for its resolution remains separate from both of those facts. Returning that question to its accurate position while remaining genuinely compassionate is one of the core competencies this work develops. Not all enforcement comes from outside. The contract is policed from within as well, through the part of your identity that has organized itself around being the person who does not let people down. Dependability is genuinely a value, not an error, not a symptom. The pride you take in being someone people can count on reflects something real and worth protecting. The difficulty is when that value begins to function as a rule with no exceptions, where any limit on availability feels like a violation of who you are rather than a reasonable adjustment to present circumstances. When unavailability threatens self-image, the response it produces internally often exceeds what the external situation requires. A single instance of responding late, or declining a request, or communicating a changed capacity can generate a level of internal alarm that suggests the boundary has threatened something much larger than a single exchange. What gets mobilized is not just concern about a specific relationship. It is the question of whether you are still the person you believe yourself to be. That question is significantly harder to tolerate than any individual disappointed expectation. The vision that follows unavailability of relationships permanently damaged, professional reputations dissolved, family roles revoked, tends to be disproportionate to what actually happened. One late response does not end a relationship. One declined request does not constitute abandonment. But the internal projection often runs to the worst available scenario, and that projection is one of the primary mechanisms through which the contract enforces itself without any external input. You enforce the terms because the alternative feels like a collapse that the evidence does not actually support. One limit is not the same as chronic unreliability. This needs to be held clearly because the enforcement mechanism depends on conflating them. The version of yourself that is occasionally unavailable, or that requires a defined window to respond, or that declines non-urgent requests outside established hours, is not a less trustworthy version of yourself. It is a more accurately calibrated one. The reliability that matters in the long run is not the reliability of never being absent, but the reliability of being genuinely present and effective when presence is genuinely needed. High standards around availability often coexist with a related pattern. The tendency to commit to more than current capacity can deliver, because undercommitting feels like the less reliable choice. The irony is that overcommitment produces the outcomes it is trying to prevent: delayed responses, incomplete work, divided attention, deteriorating quality of help. The standard that insists on being available to everyone at all times eventually undermines the standard of being genuinely useful to anyone at any given moment. Perfectionistic availability is not a form of reliability. It is a form of overextension that tends to fail precisely when the stakes are highest. Reframing the limit as capacity management rather than abandonment requires a shift in the internal language of the situation. Managing capacity means distributing access in a way that preserves genuine effectiveness across the relationships and responsibilities that matter most. It means accepting that unavailability in one context is what makes genuine availability in another context possible. The emergency duty that the contract originally honored, the response to genuine crisis, the real moment of need, remains intact in a capacity-managed system. What gets renegotiated are the non-emergency clauses that have accumulated around it. When you begin to change your access pattern, there will be specific visible failures. A task will be delayed because the person who relied on your rescue did not develop an alternative process. A family problem will go unaddressed longer than it would have with your involvement. A client situation will experience turbulence that your previous availability would have prevented. These failures are real, and naming them honestly rather than minimizing them is essential, because pretending they will not happen is not a renegotiation strategy. It is a form of avoidance that produces exactly the crisis your limits were intended to prevent. The practical disruption created by changing a long-established access pattern deserves genuine respect. Systems do not rebuild themselves instantaneously, and people who have not needed to develop particular skills or processes because you were available do not acquire them overnight. The transition period will be uncomfortable for everyone involved, and some of the discomfort will be directly traceable to your changed availability. Holding that truth without reversing course, without interpreting every failure as evidence that your limits were wrong, is one of the more demanding aspects of renegotiation. What the disruption reveals, when examined without panic, is not that your limits are impossible, but that the infrastructure around you was never built to function without your continuous involvement. That absence of infrastructure is the result of your previous availability, which means it is an artifact of the original contract, not evidence that the new terms are wrong. The appropriate response is not to restore the original terms, but to participate in building the structures that should have existed alongside your access from the beginning. Training an alternative means identifying the specific knowledge, process access, or emotional competency that others need, and then actively transferring it rather than simply withdrawing. A colleague who relied on your deadline rescues needs to understand why the work kept failing upstream, not simply discover your absence. A family member who always routed emotional difficulties toward you needs connection to other forms of support, whether other relationships, community resources, or professional services, before the routing changes. This is not an optional courtesy. It is part of the ethical responsibility of changing access that others have genuinely organized around. Documentation serves a particular function in this transition. When recurring tasks have lived in your memory rather than in any shared system, withdrawal of your access means withdrawal of institutional knowledge that no one else currently holds. Writing down the processes, the contacts, the recurring decisions, and their logic creates something that can outlast your direct involvement. It is work, and it takes time, but it is the difference between a limit that leaves the people you care about genuinely supported and a limit that leaves them stranded at the moment of greatest practical need. Emergency escalation pathways need to exist before general availability changes. The situations that genuinely require immediate access, a dependent in danger, a time-critical professional matter with real stakes, a safety issue that cannot wait, need a defined channel and a defined set of circumstances under which that channel is appropriate to use. Without a clearly communicated emergency pathway, the change in availability tends to produce either panic or creative reclassification, in which non-emergencies are framed as emergencies because that is the only channel that remains reliably open. Defining emergency access specifically and communicating it clearly protects both the people who need genuine emergency response and the integrity of the limits you are setting around everything else. Controlled consequences serve a purpose that feels uncomfortable to name, but is worth naming directly. When a colleague experiences the actual result of delayed work for the first time without your rescue available, they acquire information they did not previously have. The experience, while uncomfortable, tends to motivate the process changes that your consistent availability had previously made unnecessary. The consequence is not punishment, it is reality. The natural result of choices and systems operating without a buffer that should not have been permanent. Allowing controlled consequences to occur, in situations where they are not dangerous and where genuine safety is not at stake, is part of what makes the renegotiated contract sustainable rather than eventually reversible. What this section has mapped is the enforcement structure that surrounds the contract. The external pressure of disappointment and urgency, the internal pressure of identity, and the real disruption that availability changes create in systems built around access. None of these enforcement mechanisms is simply malicious. None of them is simply avoidable, but they are all legible now, and legibility is the beginning of a different kind of response than the automatic restoration of access that each mechanism was designed to produce. Chapter 4. The Price of Permanent Access. There is a particular quality of attention that develops in someone who is permanently available. It is not the attention of focused engagement with the present moment. It is the attention of someone who is always partly listening for the signal that will interrupt the present moment. The notification, the footstep outside the door, the phone beginning to vibrate on a surface nearby. This listening is not a neurological condition. It is a learned posture, developed through consistent experience of interruptions arriving without pattern or warning. The body and the mind having learned that interruptions come at any time, simply stop fully committing to the intervals between them. During rest, the monitoring continues. During meals shared with people you love, a portion of awareness is reserved for whatever might require your attention. During the early stages of sleep, the sound of an arriving message can surface you from a depth that recovers slowly and imperfectly. The reservation of attention for potential demands is not a decision you make freshly each time. It has become background infrastructure, running quietly beneath whatever activity you are nominally engaged in. The cost does not announce itself dramatically. It surfaces in the minor failures that accumulate across months. The conversation you were partially present for, the task you completed with fewer resources than it deserved. Important work, the kind that requires sustained engagement without interruption, begins to disappear from your days, not because you have no time for it, but because no interval feels reliable enough to begin it without reservation. You know from experience that the interval may be claimed without notice. So you choose work that can tolerate interruption, tasks that can be set down and resumed, obligations that do not require depth. The concentrated generative work that used to exist in your schedule migrates to the margins and then out of the schedule entirely, because the contract has pre-assigned too much of your attention to remaining reachable. The people who are physically present with you, a partner, children, an aging parent, a friend you rarely see, receive the portion of your attention that the monitoring does not consume. This is not a small thing. The person who notices that you are technically present but internally elsewhere is not wrong. Something is missing from the interaction, and what is missing is the full quality of attention that genuine presence requires. The monitoring that keeps you available to the people who might reach out is precisely what limits your availability to the people who are already there. The willingness was real at the beginning. This is not a retrospective invention. There was genuine care, genuine satisfaction in being helpful, genuine pleasure in being the person others could count on. The first 100 requests, or the first few years of sustained availability, did not feel like a burden. They felt like an expression of something authentic about who you are and how you relate to the people around you. What changed was not the character of the care, but the relationship between the supply of care and the demand placed on it. Every system of generosity has a carrying capacity, a threshold beyond which continued output requires more than is being replenished. The problem with the availability contract is that the carrying capacity is not declared in its terms. The contract does not contain a clause that says the terms apply only while your capacity remains above a certain level. It continues to draw on the account regardless of what the account currently holds. The practical result of exceeding that threshold is the emergence of yes spoken in a voice that means no. You respond, you help, you remain accessible. But the internal experience of doing so has shifted from something freely given to something extracted. The shift is gradual enough that you often cannot identify the specific transaction at which the change occurred, only that at some point the same behavior that once felt like an expression of care began to feel like a tax. Resentment, when it develops under these conditions, tends to attach to the recipient of the help rather than to the structural arrangement that produced the problem. The colleague who sends the message, the family member who calls, the friend who needs to process their difficulty, they become the objects of a frustration that actually belongs to the contract itself. This misattribution is understandable. The recipient is visible and the contract is not. But the misattribution creates a secondary problem because it directs energy toward specific people rather than toward the terms that are generating the cost. The honest framing requires accepting shared responsibility for the situation. The people who are accessing you have largely been doing what your availability invited them to do. They were not given information about the cost. They were given continued access, which is a form of communication. The uncommunicated problem, the growing gap between what you were providing and what you were willing to provide, is partly a problem of communication that preceded this current difficulty. Identifying this does not erase external accountability. It prevents the audit from becoming a catalogue of others' failures at the expense of examining your own contribution to the arrangement. What resentment costs in the domain of actual service quality is considerable. Help offered with hidden grievance is different help than help offered freely. The emotional availability that once made your presence genuinely stabilizing becomes diluted by the effort required to manage the frustration beneath it. The practical quality of your solutions declines when the resources that would have gone into them are partly consumed by the work of tolerating the request. The people you are helping receive a diminished version of the capacity they believe they are accessing, and they rarely know why. The hidden invoice accumulates, payable in the eventual deterioration of the relationship or the collapse of your ability to continue. The contract eventually produces its own failure condition. When you have committed your availability across too many people, channels, and contexts simultaneously, the quality of each individual commitment degrades. A task that should have received 3 hours of focused attention receives 45 interrupted minutes across 3 days. A conversation that deserved full presence occurs while another request waits in the background. An important deadline, buried under urgent but less significant demands, arrives before anyone remembered it was approaching. The promises begin to slip. Not the promises you made reluctantly, but the ones you made sincerely, at a moment when your intention to follow through was genuine. The problem is that intention operates at the moment of promising, while capacity operates at the moment of delivery, and the gap between those two moments is where the over-availability contract tends to extract its most visible costs. You meant to complete the work, you meant to be present at that meeting, you meant to return the call. But the accumulation of prior access commitments consumed the resources that would have made those intentions executable. The paradox at the center of permanent availability is that it produces something that looks, from the outside, like unreliability. The person who commits to everything because every request feels essential ends up delivering less to each than the person who commits to fewer things with more deliberate care. The colleague who knows you are always reachable, but whose requests are increasingly lost in your overcommitted attention, begins to trust you less than they trusted the colleague who was explicitly available only within a defined window, but reliably delivered within that window. Emergency responsiveness, the capacity that the original contract was presumably built around, the real usefulness for moments of genuine crisis, is one of the first casualties of chronic overextension. When all of your attention is already committed, there is no reserve available for the moment that actually warrants mobilization. The person who is available to everything is paradoxically unavailable for the thing that matters most, because the buffer that genuine emergency response requires has been consumed by the steady drain of non-emergency access. Availability and reliability are different quantities. Availability is the breadth of access, how reachable you are across how many contexts and channels and hours. Reliability is the consistency between commitment and delivery. These two quantities are often treated as identical, as though being more reachable automatically produces more reliable outcomes. The lived experience of sustained over-availability tends to demonstrate the opposite. As breadth of access expands beyond carrying capacity, reliability of delivery contracts. Fewer, clearer commitments, honored consistently, tend to produce a more trustworthy experience of your presence than unlimited access that delivers unevenly. What a capacity-based approach to availability preserves, crucially, is the contingency plan. A schedule that includes defined windows of access also includes explicit provisions for genuine emergencies, ensuring that the most important claims on your attention retain a guaranteed pathway, even as lower priority access is structured more deliberately. This is not the same as building walls. It is the difference between a resource that is deployed thoughtfully and a resource that has been left undefended, available to the first demand that arrives rather than to the needs that genuinely warrant it. This distinction is the foundation of the audit that comes next. Chapter 5. The Availability Contract Audit. The first step of the audit is inventory. Before any renegotiation is possible, the full scope of current access needs to be visible in a single picture, rather than experienced as an undifferentiated background condition. Begin with individuals and systems. Every person who reaches out to you with any expectation of response, and every institutional system, work platforms, client portals, family group chats, organizational responsibilities, that routes requests toward you. Write them down. The inventory is often larger than initial memory suggests, because some access has become so normalized that it no longer registers as access at all. For each person and system identified, note the channels through which contact arrives: phone calls, text messages, work email, personal email, messaging applications, platforms that notify you in real time, shared digital spaces where your participation is assumed. The number of channels typically exceeds what felt present in a general sense, because different relationships use different pathways, and pathways that are quiet in one period may become active in another. The full channel map clarifies where the contract operates and how many simultaneous points of access are currently open. Response speed expectations deserve their own column in the inventory. For each person and system, identify what speed of reply the access pattern implies. Same hour, same day, within the business day, before end of week. The expectation around response speed is often tacit, but can usually be inferred from what happens when the window is not met, from the follow-up message, the tone of the conversation when contact is eventually made, the degree of expressed concern about your delay. Where speed expectations are unclear, noting that ambiguity itself is information. Document the recurring types of requests that arrive through each access point. Administrative questions, emotional support conversations, problem-solving requests, logistical coordination, technical assistance, escalated situations that others have begun but cannot complete. Crisis response. The categories of request matter for the later audit step that distinguishes legitimate duty from assumed access, because the legitimacy of a given type of request tends to vary by context and relationship, even when the channel through which it arrives is the same. Examine which access points in your inventory reflect an explicit agreement, a formal arrangement, a deliberate conversation about access, a written or clearly verbal commitment you made with full knowledge of its terms. These explicit agreements are the smallest portion of most inventories. Most access points, when examined honestly, cannot be traced to an explicit negotiation. They can only be traced to behavior, to the accumulating record of your responses over time. Mark the assumed access separately. These are the relationships and systems in which access was never formally negotiated, but currently operates as though it were. The size of this category in most inventories is the clearest demonstration of the contract's fundamental nature. The contract is not a collection of remembered agreements, it is an inference, drawn from behavior, maintained by repetition, enforced by the mechanisms described in the previous section. Finally, identify the emergency responsibilities within the inventory. Who or what constitutes a genuine emergency claim on your access? A dependent whose safety requires responsiveness, a professional role that carries real-time duty, a specific person or situation in which delayed access creates genuine and irreversible harm. Emergency responsibilities are not a residual category to be minimized. They are the protected core around which the renegotiated contract must be built. Everything else in the inventory will be examined and potentially adjusted. Emergency access is the part that the adjustment must never compromise. With the inventory visible, the next work is consequence mapping. For each person or system with current access, identify who bears the primary consequence if the request goes unaddressed. Sometimes the answer is clearly you, your professional standing, your legal or institutional responsibility, your dependents' well-being. Sometimes the answer is the requesting party, their project, their deadline, their unresolved difficulty. Often the honest answer is, the consequence belongs primarily to them, but they have successfully transferred the urgency to you without transferring the underlying ownership. Decision authority is a useful secondary test. Who holds the actual authority to resolve the situation being raised? In many cases, the person routing a request toward you has more decision-making capacity than they are exercising. The request arrives partly because your involvement feels easier than the decisions they would need to make independently. identifying whether you are being consulted because you have specific knowledge or authority, or because your involvement substitutes for someone else's decision, clarifies the ownership question considerably. Contractual and moral duty occupy their own category and deserve explicit marking. These are not the same as historical expectation or relational familiarity. A contractual duty is one that was genuinely negotiated and carries real obligations, professional responsibilities, legal agreements, parenting duties, financial commitments with enforceable terms. A moral duty exists where the genuine well-being of someone who cannot adequately advocate for themselves depends on your action. Both categories are real and require respect. They are also finite and specific rather than unlimited and ambient. For any request that your involvement does not fall under contractual or moral duty, identify who else can act. In most cases, someone else can. The alternative may be slower, less skilled, or less immediately satisfying than your involvement, but the existence of an alternative is the relevant fact. When no alternative currently exists, note whether that absence reflects genuine uniqueness of your knowledge or capacity, or whether it reflects the fact that alternatives were never built because your access was always available. These are very different situations, and the distinction determines whether the path forward involves transferring the responsibility or building the infrastructure that allows it to be transferred. Safety exceptions require their own row in the consequence map. There are situations in which unavailability creates a genuine safety risk that neither redirecting to an alternative nor waiting for a scheduled window adequately addresses. These situations are usually specific, a particular person in a particular circumstance, not a general category of emotional distress or workplace urgency. Identifying them specifically prevents both the error of treating all distress as safety critical and the error of treating nothing as genuinely urgent. Who benefits from the current access arrangement is worth examining directly. The benefit is often mutual. You receive the sense of usefulness and significance that comes with being reliably needed, while others receive the practical and emotional resources you provide. But the distribution of benefit is rarely equal, and the distribution of cost is rarely proportionate. Some access arrangements benefit the accessing party substantially, while costing you significantly. Others are more genuinely reciprocal. The benefit and cost map is part of what allows the final classification to be accurate, rather than either self-justifying or self-punishing. What you sacrifice deserves an explicit accounting. Time, obviously. Attention. The focused work that gets displaced. The rest that becomes monitoring. The relationships that receive diminished presence. The creative or generative capacity that goes unfed because the access contract has pre-committed too much bandwidth. Writing these costs down specifically and honestly creates the clarity that renegotiation requires. Vague discomfort is difficult to communicate and easy to override. Specific named costs are both more honest and more defensible. Classify each access relationship along a spectrum: required, negotiated, optional, or expired. Required access reflects genuine duty. It should not be renegotiated, only organized more clearly. Negotiated access reflects mutual agreement that remains current. It may be refined, but should be honored as agreed. Optional access reflects access that the other party assumed, but that you never explicitly granted and do not have a duty to maintain. This is the category with the most renegotiation opportunity. Expired access reflects terms that were appropriate in an earlier period or circumstance, but whose conditions have changed sufficiently that continuation is no longer warranted. The audit has produced a map. The natural response to a complete map of an overwhelming arrangement is to want to change everything immediately, to announce new terms across every relationship and system at once, to finally resolve the entire contract in a single act of clarity. This impulse is understandable and should be set aside. Renegotiating every clause simultaneously is not a strategy. It is a disruption that tends to produce maximum resistance while building minimum sustainable change. The audit identified everything that requires attention. The first step addresses one thing: select the clause that creates the greatest avoidable cost with the clearest possibility of change. The emphasis belongs on both parts of that criterion. The cost should be significant and real rather than minor, and the possibility of change should be genuine rather than theoretical. A clause that generates enormous cost but cannot currently be changed without creating serious harm to a vulnerable dependent is not the right starting point. A clause that generates moderate but consistent daily cost and that could be renegotiated with a specific person without creating genuine harm is a better candidate than it might initially appear. Define the new term specifically before communicating it. Vague intentions around availability produce vague expectations, which produce ongoing negotiation about what was meant. A specific term identifies the communication channel, the response window, the days or times it applies, and the circumstances that fall outside it. The more specific the new term, the less interpretive labor the other party needs to do, and the less room there is for the expectation to drift back toward its previous form. Every renegotiated term requires a stated exception. Unlimited access is not being offered in one domain, but emergency access in that domain is still available under defined circumstances. The exception is not a concession to the enforcement mechanism. It is an honest acknowledgement that genuine emergencies exist and that your renegotiated access does not apply to them. Stating the exception clearly prevents the legitimate need from becoming a pretext for reinstating the old term, because the exception is specific enough to be checked against actual situations rather than invoked as a general override. The transition window is also specific. Changed access that takes effect without notice, applied immediately to relationships that have organized substantially around the previous terms, tends to produce the maximum possible disruption. A reasonable transition period, communicated clearly with a defined endpoint, gives other parties time to adjust their planning, develop alternatives, and ask questions before the new terms become the daily reality. The transition window is not a delay of the renegotiation. It is the implementation of it in a form that is more likely to hold. Communication about the new terms happens in language that does not assign blame, does not require the other party to agree that their previous access was wrongful, and does not demand an acknowledgement that never arrives before the new terms take effect. The communication conveys information about changed access, states the new terms, identifies the exception, names the transition window, and closes. It does not open a debate about the history of the arrangement. It announces a changed reality. Before the renegotiation conversation is prepared, take a moment for one direct question. Which person, system, or relationship in the inventory is currently the most persistent source of assumed access? The one that reaches for you most reliably, without checking whether access is genuinely available. Identifying that source by name, privately not for public disclosure, is the reflective exercise that precedes the renegotiation. The identification is for your own clarity. What you name privately will clarify what you address in the renegotiation, and what you address in the renegotiation will be more sustainable if it begins from honest identification rather than generalized frustration. Resistance will arrive. Its specific form depends on which clause you selected, which relationship it operates in, and which enforcement mechanisms are most active in that context. The resistance is not evidence that the renegotiation was wrong. It is evidence that the previous terms were real enough to matter to the other party, which is true of every clause worth renegotiating. Before beginning that conversation, the renegotiation needs language. Chapter 6. Renegotiating access. The conversation about changed access begins with the access pattern rather than with a grievance. Before the other party has a chance to form a defensive response, the framing establishes that this is a communication about your availability, not an accusation about their behavior, not a retrospective audit of their requests, not an opening argument in a case against them. You are telling them something true about how access to you will work going forward. The subject is your capacity and your terms, not their conduct. State what has changed about your capacity without requiring them to understand or agree with its cause. The specific reasons for your changed capacity, the accumulated cost, the resentment, the monitoring that has replaced rest, are yours to hold. The other party needs to know what the new terms are, not the full history of why they became necessary. Offering more explanation than the new terms require tends to invite negotiation about the explanation rather than acceptance of the terms. The explanation is yours, the terms are theirs to receive. Define the normal response window that applies to your communication with this person or system going forward. Not a vague statement of increased difficulty reaching you, but a specific window, a particular number of hours, a particular set of days, a particular channel through which responses arrive within that window. The specificity is not bureaucratic, it is respectful. It gives the other party accurate information they can actually use, rather than an ambiguous reduction in access that requires them to guess continuously about what has changed. Name the emergency channel explicitly. This is the communication pathway and the category of circumstances under which your previous access speed still applies. The emergency channel should be specific enough that it cannot be easily reinterpreted as a general override. It names a channel, a specific phone number, a designated messaging application, a direct call rather than a text, and names the category of situation that warrants its use. Defining the emergency channel before the conversation ends prevents the most significant source of immediate resistance: the fear that limiting regular access means abandoning emergency access. State clearly what remains available. The renegotiation is not a removal of the relationship. Your care, your attention, your willingness to engage, these remain. What has changed is the terms under which access to them operates. Making this explicit addresses the relational anxiety that new terms often produce, without restoring the access pattern you are changing. There is a significant difference between communicating that you are less reachable and communicating that you are unavailable, and that difference should be stated rather than assumed. Avoid moral indictment of the previous arrangement in the language of the new terms. Stating that the previous access was wrong, that their requests were unfair, or that the old terms should never have been accepted, opens a historical argument that is unlikely to produce agreement and tends to generate the most defensive resistance. The previous terms are over not because they were wrongful, but because they are no longer the terms that apply. This framing is not dishonest. It is accurate in the most practically useful sense. Avoid excessive explanation. The impulse to explain at length, to give a full account of the cost, to make the case comprehensively, to ensure that the other party understands everything that led to this decision, is a familiar feature of someone who has been managing others' comfort for a long time. Comprehensive explanation often functions as an implicit request for permission. You do not need permission to change your access terms. State the terms clearly and briefly. Answer genuine practical questions when they arise, and resist the pull toward justification that seeks approval before taking effect. Before the conversation ends, confirm when the new terms begin. Not immediately after the conversation concludes necessarily, but at a specific point in time that allows for the transition planning described previously. The beginning date is part of the communication, not a follow-up detail. Without it, the other party does not know whether the new terms are in effect now or at some undefined future point, which tends to produce either immediate testing of the old terms or anxious uncertainty about how to proceed. A limit that removes access without providing any pathway forward for the practical needs that previous access was meeting is not a boundary. It is a withdrawal. The ethical requirement of renegotiating access that others have genuinely organized around is to participate actively in building the alternative infrastructure, not merely to declare that the alternative is their responsibility. This is both a practical necessity and a moral one. Genuine duty does not end at the edge of your personal inconvenience, and the people whose reliance on you was partly produced by your own sustained availability have a reasonable claim on your active assistance in finding alternatives. Identify who or what can provide backup coverage for the recurring access functions you are stepping back from. In a work context, this may be a colleague, a supervisor, a shared service, or a documented process. In a family context, it may be another family member, a professional service, a community resource, or a friend with relevant capacity. In a caregiving context, it may involve qualified services that the previous arrangement had deferred because your access was available. The backup does not need to be identical to you. It needs to be adequate for the situations your renegotiated terms will no longer cover. Information transfer is essential where your previous access carried knowledge that no one else currently holds. The recurring process that exists only in your memory, the contact who reaches you through a channel no one else uses. The decision logic that you apply automatically but have never documented. All of this is institutional knowledge that your withdrawal will remove unless you actively transfer it. The transfer takes time and attention, which may feel counterproductive at a moment when you are trying to reduce your commitments. It is not counterproductive. It is the investment that makes your reduced access sustainable rather than eventually coerced into reversal. Training another person to handle what you have previously handled is sometimes the most important transition activity, and also the one most easily avoided. Teaching takes longer than doing, and doing feels more immediately helpful than the slower work of building someone else's capacity. But a limit that requires your continuous maintenance, that can only hold as long as you actively prevent others from routing around it, will eventually fail. Training someone else to handle what has always been routed toward you creates a structural change rather than a personal position you must continually defend. Document recurring tasks in sufficient detail that someone unfamiliar with your process can execute them without your involvement. The documentation does not need to be comprehensive for every possible variation. It needs to cover the situations that arise with predictable frequency. For the access relationships you are renegotiating, recurring tasks are the ones most likely to produce immediate requests when your response time changes. Documenting them in advance prevents the documentation conversation from occurring under pressure, when the request has already arrived and the urgency has already been established. Scheduled support, offered intentionally rather than available continuously, tends to serve the underlying need more reliably than the ambient access it replaces. If a family member has needed frequent emotional support that you have been providing on demand, a scheduled weekly conversation, offered deliberately and kept reliably, often provides more genuine relational connection than the previous pattern of interrupted availability. Intentional support, given fully within its defined time, is a different quality of presence than access that is technically constant but practically fragmented. The first response to changed access terms is rarely acceptance. Surprise, disappointment, and escalating urgency, the enforcement mechanisms identified earlier, tend to arrive in some combination when new terms are communicated. The fact that they arrive is not evidence that the renegotiation was wrong. It is evidence that the previous terms had real value to the person who depended on them, which is simply an accurate fact rather than an indictment of either party. Listen carefully to the initial response, because not all of its content is enforcement mechanism. Within the protest, there may be legitimate practical questions that the new terms did not fully address, a specific obligation that falls in the transition window, a genuine need that the alternative plan does not adequately cover, a timeline concern that a small adjustment would resolve. Distinguishing between practical questions that deserve engagement and relational pressure that deserves acknowledgement without reversal is one of the core skills of surviving the first protest. Both may be present simultaneously in the same conversation, where the initial response surfaces a genuine practical problem, a real gap in the alternative plan, a real need that the emergency channel definition did not capture. Adjust the implementation rather than the underlying term. The adjustment is not a concession of principle. It is a recognition that practical implementation requires refinement when it contacts the actual complexity of the relationship. Adjusting the how is different from reversing the what. The distinction between these two kinds of response needs to be maintained clearly because the pressure of the first protest tends to make them feel identical. What does not deserve reversal is a global identity accusation. When the response to new terms is an argument that the terms reveal who you really are, that they demonstrate the absence of care, that they contradict the person the relationship has always known, the argument is addressed to your identity rather than to the terms you stated. Responding to it by restoring the previous terms demonstrates that the identity accusation worked. The accurate response names the accusation without accepting its conclusion. The terms say something about your current access capacity, not about the character of your care. These two things are genuinely different. Repeat the term briefly if the response attempts to negotiate it open. Not defensively, not with additional justification, but with the consistency that communicates that the term is not a bargaining position. The brevity of the repetition matters. Long justifications invite counter-arguments. A brief, calm restatement of the same information communicates stability rather than defensiveness, and stability is what establishes the new term as a real constraint rather than an opening offer. Retaliatory withdrawal, reducing access far below what the renegotiation specified, out of frustration with the protest, is both unfair and counterproductive. The person who has just communicated new reasonable terms and then, under protest, withdraws significantly further has not demonstrated a boundary. They have demonstrated that protest changes terms, which is precisely the wrong lesson for the relationship to learn at this moment. The new terms are the terms. Hold them specifically. Allow others to develop their own responses to the changed access reality, even when those responses are initially inefficient or uncomfortable. The colleague who has to figure out a deadline problem without your rescue will find a path or they will not, and what follows will be informative either way. The family member who has to tolerate a difficult conversation longer before help arrives may discover that they have more capacity for it than they believed. The alternative infrastructure does not build itself. It builds through the experience of needing to exist. Your restraint in the period after renegotiation is part of what creates the conditions for that building to occur. Track actual outcomes rather than projected ones. The scenarios that make renegotiation feel dangerous, the relationship that will not survive, the professional standing that will collapse, the family system that will fracture, are worth testing against what actually happens after the new terms take effect. In most cases, the actual disruption is smaller than the projected disruption, and the outcomes that follow are more recoverable than the enforcement mechanisms suggested they would be. The record of actual outcomes is the most reliable correction to the internal projection that keeps the old terms in place. Final chapter, the new availability charter. The new availability charter begins with specificity rather than good intentions. A commitment to be more deliberate about access, held privately and applied inconsistently, does not constitute a charter. A charter is a legible system, one that the people who need to access you can understand and plan around, one that you can sustain without continuous renegotiation, and one that you yourself can remember and apply without daily effort. Legibility is what separates a charter from a resolution. Define communication windows for each major domain of your life. The windows do not need to be identical across domains. Work access operates differently than personal access, and personal access operates differently than the access you maintain for caregiving responsibilities. What matters is that each domain has a window, and that the window is specific enough to be real. I respond to messages during business hours is more legible than I'm less available than I used to be, and both are vastly more useful than no stated terms at all. Separate work channels from personal channels in a way that is visible to the people in each domain. This separation is not a pretense. It is a genuine structural distinction between contexts that carry different legitimate claims on your availability. Allowing work requests to arrive through channels you associate with personal connection, or allowing personal emotional content to arrive through channels you associate with professional responsibility, tends to blur both the charter and the psychological boundary between the two contexts. Clean channel separation makes the charter easier to maintain and easier for others to navigate. Define focus or rest periods, windows during which you are not monitoring for incoming requests, and communicate them where the communication is appropriate and sufficient. Not every rest period requires announcement. Some do. The family or colleague who habitually reaches out during a particular time deserves to know that that time is protected. Others benefit from simple consistency. When you are reliably unreachable during certain hours, the pattern itself communicates the boundary without requiring ongoing declaration. Predictable availability is more valuable than maximum availability. The person who knows that you respond reliably between certain hours that you check messages at predictable intervals, and that you distinguish clearly between routine and emergency access has more useful information about how to reach you than the person who has unlimited access that is delivered inconsistently. Predictability is a form of reliability. It allows others to plan accurately rather than reaching out continuously in hopes of catching you in a responsive moment. Flexibility is a feature of a well-constructed charter, not a threat to it. A charter that has no room for genuine variation, that treats every deviation from its terms as a failure, will eventually break under the pressure of real life's legitimate variability. Build the flexibility deliberately, rather than letting it accumulate as a series of exceptions that erode the charter gradually. Scheduled flexibility, a weekly review, a seasonal adjustment, is different from continuous renegotiation in response to whoever is currently exerting the most pressure. Review the charter against recurring needs periodically. The access terms that serve well during one season of life may require adjustment during another. A caregiving responsibility that increases, a professional role that changes, a relationship that deepens or that has concluded. These changes should produce deliberate charter adjustments rather than unexamined drift back toward permanent availability. The charter is not a fixed document. It is a living system, and its vitality depends on being examined rather than merely sustained by momentum. Allow the charter to adjust with seasons, both literal and personal. Some periods require more focused protection of attention. Others allow more generous access. A charter that accounts for predictable seasonal variation in both demand and capacity is more sustainable than one that sets a single standard and treats any departure from it as a failure of resolve. The review point built into the charter is where these seasonal adjustments are made deliberately rather than reactively. Genuine emergency access is not a reluctant concession, it is the protected core of the charter. The charter exists partly to ensure that when a real emergency occurs, your capacity to respond to it has not already been consumed by the accumulated non-emergencies that the old contract treated with equal urgency. Defining emergency access with precision is therefore not a restriction, it is a preservation. An emergency for the purposes of the charter is a situation in which inaction creates genuine and significant harm that cannot be adequately addressed by available alternatives within a reasonable time. This definition is narrower than the definition of urgency that operates in the old contract, where the sender's level of distress tended to determine the urgency category. Real emergencies are defined by their objective consequence, not by the subjective experience of the person encountering them. Most situations that arrive with the language of emergency do not meet this criterion. The ones that do are identifiable and specific. Qualified emergency resources, professional services, institutional supports, community crisis resources should be identified and communicated alongside your emergency channel. Part of what defined emergency access clearly is knowing which situations belong to your emergency channel and which belong to a professional resource that has both greater capacity and greater expertise. A medical emergency belongs in a medical system. A mental health crisis has professional resources associated with it. Routing the right emergency to the right resource protects both the person in need and the integrity of the emergency channel you have defined for genuine personal duty. Define who may use the emergency channel with sufficient specificity that routine requests cannot be routed through it by reclassification. An emergency channel open to everyone who decides their need is urgent enough is not an emergency channel. It is the old contract with a new name. The people authorized to use the emergency channel should be named or described by category, and the circumstances that warrant its use should be described specifically enough that both parties can check a real situation against the definition rather than invoking it as a general override. Protect the emergency channel from routine use through consistent response. When non-emergency requests arrive through the emergency channel, acknowledge receipt without immediate full response, and then address them through the appropriate channel at the appropriate time. This consistency is not coldness. It is the maintenance of the distinction that makes the emergency channel meaningful. An emergency channel that handles everything handles nothing better than the general access it replaced. Caregiving and dependent needs occupy a special category in the emergency access framework. A dependent whose well-being requires genuine responsiveness, a young child, an aging parent with health complications, a person whose disability requires support, holds a different kind of claim than a colleague or peer who experiences their need as urgent. The Charter explicitly protects the former while applying the new terms to the latter. This distinction is not always simple to draw, and the complexity deserves honest engagement rather than resolution through formula. But the principle is clear. Genuine dependence on your access for safety and well-being is not the same category of claim as the comfort preference that drives most high-frequency requests. Avoid heroic overreach within the emergency framework, the tendency to respond to every situation flagged as an emergency, as though full capacity mobilization is required. Some situations that meet the criterion for emergency access require a brief response that confirms awareness and routes toward appropriate help, rather than comprehensive personal involvement. The capacity to distinguish between emergency acknowledgement and emergency rescue is part of what makes emergency access sustainable rather than exhausting. Not every genuine emergency requires your maximum output. Some require your presence, your calm, and your routing, and those are manageable. Review recurring crises structurally rather than treating each individual instance as requiring an identical emergency response. When a particular person or system produces emergency-level requests with consistent frequency, the recurring nature of the crises is itself important information. Recurring crises often indicate an underlying structural problem, inadequate alternative supports, an escalating condition, a systemic gap that individual emergency responses are addressing but not resolving. The structural review asks what would need to change for the crises to occur less frequently, and whether your emergency responses are contributing to that change or simply managing each instance in isolation. Once the Charter exists, help can be offered differently, not extracted by the contract's terms, not provided under the pressure of assumed access, but offered from a starting point that is genuine, where there is actual capacity, actual willingness, actual presence available to give. Intentional help begins with a choice rather than a reflex. The choice can be made when you see a need clearly, when your current capacity allows a meaningful response, and when the offering is not a substitution for someone else's accountability for their own difficulty. Define the scope of help when you offer it, not because every generous act requires a legal brief, but because help offered without scope tends to expand beyond what either party originally envisioned. When you offer to assist with a specific task, naming the specific task creates a shared understanding that the offer covers that task rather than every related task that subsequently becomes visible. This precision is not ungenerous, it is honest. It prevents the common experience in which an offer of one thing gradually becomes an obligation for everything adjacent to it. Define the timing as part of the offer. Not a rigid schedule that turns generosity into bureaucracy, but a realistic picture of when the help will occur and how much of your attention it will receive. I can help with this on Thursday afternoon, and give it about 2 hours is more useful than let me know what you need, both for the person receiving help and for your ability to deliver what you promised. Timing definition is one of the simplest ways to prevent a genuine offer from becoming an overextended commitment that erodes the quality of what is eventually provided. Confirm whose decisions remain theirs throughout the help you are providing. Generosity that gradually takes over decision-making produces dependence rather than capability, and it tends to extend the duration of the support commitment beyond what either party initially imagined. When the help you offer includes a clear retention of the other party's ownership over their own situation, their choices, their timeline, their assessment of what constitutes a satisfactory outcome, the support serves them without replacing them. This distinction is consistently one of the most practically important features of genuinely useful help. End the support when you said it would end. Not abruptly, not without acknowledgement, but at the point that was agreed upon at the outset. Help that does not have a conclusion becomes a new instance of the old contract, open-ended access that continues because stopping requires a renegotiation that neither party initiated. The ending does not mean the relationship ends. It means this particular commitment fulfilled its scope and its time. The relationship can generate new commitments under the new terms. It should not simply continue the previous commitment because the conclusion felt difficult to mark. Offer help without hidden invoices, without the expectation of reciprocal access, the accumulating ledger of what is owed, or the private record of what your generosity entitles you to later. The invoice system corrupts the help in both directions. It turns your offering into a transaction, and it turns the recipient's acceptance into a debt. Genuine generosity under the new charter does not require reciprocal tracking. It requires only that the scope, timing, and ownership were clear at the start, that the help was delivered within those terms, and that the conclusion arrived at the agreed point. Something changes in the quality of your presence when the help is freely chosen within sustainable terms. The person receiving it notices, even if they cannot name what is different. What they are receiving is not a service provided under obligation. It is a genuine offering from someone who has capacity and care and is directing them toward this specific situation at this specific time. That quality is not available from the old contract, because the old contract consumed the conditions under which it could exist. The interruption that arrived at the beginning of this book, the message containing a task and a deadline and an assumption, stands now in a different context. It has not changed. The message still expects the same access it has always expected. What has changed is the ground on which it lands. The charter exists. The audit is complete. The clauses have been named and examined. The alternative infrastructure is in development. The emergency channel is defined. The response to the message is now a choice rather than a reflex. The response you make from the charter is not a refusal of the relationship. It is a demonstration of the new terms. It acknowledges the request, routes it appropriately within the defined access window, and signals clearly what the sender can expect and when. The urgency in the message does not automatically override the charter. The history of your availability does not automatically reinstate the old terms. The access that existed before is no longer the default. What exists now is the access you have defined, offered by choice, within the capacity you have honestly assessed. The master loop closes here, not with a signature on the old contract, but with the recognition that access is now yours to grant. Epilogue, the blank signature line. Return to the beginning for a moment. The message that arrived during protected time. The task, the deadline, the assumption. Reading it now after everything the audit has uncovered and the charter has built, the message contains the same words it always did. What has changed is the framework through which it passes before reaching you. Who owns the consequence of this request? Is this situation within or outside the defined access window? Does it qualify as a genuine emergency? Who else can act? What does the charter specify? These are no longer abstract questions. They are applied ones, answering themselves quickly because the work of the audit made them answerable. Applying the ownership test, the timing test, and the duty classification to this specific message takes less time than writing a response did under the old terms. The clarity the audit provides is not laborious, it is efficient. The message is either a genuine emergency that warrants immediate engagement, a legitimate request that will receive a response within the defined window, or an assumed access request that receives an honest reply about timing and routing. One of these three responses is appropriate. The task is simply to determine which one, and the charter provides the determination. The response that arrives from the charter is more useful to the sender than the automatic response the old contract produced. It is made with full attention rather than fragmented monitoring. It carries genuine care rather than resentful compliance. It is honest about timing rather than implying availability that does not exist. It routes genuine emergencies with real urgency and genuine non-emergencies with genuine patience. The sender receives something real, delivered from actual capacity, rather than something reflexive, delivered from the exhausted infrastructure of permanent availability. Reliability through the new charter is not measured by how many requests you respond to or how quickly the response arrives across every possible channel. It is measured by the consistency between what you have committed to and what you deliver. A smaller set of commitments, honored consistently and fully, produces more trustworthy reliability than unlimited promises delivered unevenly under the pressure of accumulating obligation. The people who genuinely depend on you, who have legitimate claims on your attention, who hold the kinds of access your charter defines as required or negotiated, receive a more reliable version of you than the old contract ever provided. Their needs were being met more slowly, more fragmentedly, and with less actual care than they deserved, because the contract had committed your attention to too many simultaneous claims. Generosity without permanent surrender is not a diminished form of generosity. It is the only form of generosity that can be sustained across the full length of the relationships that matter. The care that has a beginning, a defined scope and an end, is care that can be genuinely renewed. Care that does not exhaust itself through overextension into a resentful performance of availability. The people you love and the work you care about are better served by a version of you that has protected the conditions under which genuine care can be offered than by a version that has given everything away and arrives to the most important moments depleted. The blank signature line on the old contract, the space where your agreement should have been but never was, is no longer interpreted as consent. The previous terms remain archived in their original form. The speed clause, the priority clause, the access clause, the calming and rescue clauses, the permanence and gratitude clauses, all held together in the record of how things were. The blank line is simply blank now. It requires an actual signature to become a term, and signatures are given deliberately, in specific circumstances, for defined periods, by someone who has read what they are agreeing to. The charter is what replaces the blank line, not a refusal but a legible, chosen, sustainable agreement made with the full awareness of what it contains. Of all the clauses the contract contained, the speed expectation, the priority assumption, the permanence inherited from shared history, which one has been the hardest to renegotiate? Not in theory, but in your specific life, in the relationship where the old terms ran deepest. The answer to that question belongs to you privately, but sitting with it honestly is the next piece of real work. The clause that resists renegotiation most persistently tends to be the one most entangled with something beyond the practical, something about identity, about history, about what a particular relationship has meant and what it would mean to change its terms. That entanglement deserves its own examination. When the clause that resists most does so, because you find yourself returning again and again to an access pattern you have already clearly identified as costly. When you discover that you are drawn back, not by genuine duty or genuine care, but by something else, something that keeps the old terms compelling even after you have recognized they were never yours to agree to. That pattern points toward the next folio. The reversal folio examines a related but distinct phenomenon, how the fear of rejection can make something continue to compel you long after the thing being rejected has stopped being genuinely desired. The mechanics of renegotiation covered here and the mechanics of rejection covered, there are different instruments in the same larger manual, different clauses in the broader contract between who you have been and who you are choosing to become.